Welcome everybody to Breakthrough Ideas in the Spotlight. Today we are putting a border expert in the spotlight to talk about the border crisis that is occurring in Texas. So I'm interviewing, and I'm very thankful for this interview, with Josh Jones. Josh is a senior fellow in border security for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He conducts organized crime and security assessments in Mexico, evaluating threats to Texas, other Southwest border states, and the national security interests of the United States. He's an 18-year veteran of the U.S. Department of Justice. He previously worked in the front lines of transnational criminal organization investigations as a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C. and San Diego, California. Josh's work took him from Colombia, cocoa fields, and Guatemalan jungles to the mountains of the Golden Triangle in Mexico. We are talking with an expert here. And his work has led to arrests and prosecutions of some of the most notorious criminal organization leaders in the history of Latin America. Most recently, he served as the Attorney General's Task Force Vulcan, a task force created to eliminate the threat of MS-13 in the United States. He's won numerous National Case of the Year awards from the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, the Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program. He's a native of Georgia and a graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law. And so we welcome Josh to this program because this is exactly what Breakthrough Ideas wants to do with these longer form interviews in the spotlight. We want to bring things that are happening nationally down to the local level, down to right into the western suburbs of Chicago, because anybody who thinks that what's happening at the border doesn't affect you up here in this area is not being truthful. We know well that it does affect us. It affects our national security, which we all have a part in. It actually affects our financial security as well, as these migrants come into especially sanctuary states like the state of Illinois and the Chicagoland area, which has its own level of problems financially. So we welcome Josh to the program. And Josh, I'm just going to start out with a poll that actually the Texas Policy group did, and it says that the number of Texans who say there's a crisis at the border is the highest it's been in over a year, with the percentage of those who say it is the most important issue Texas policies should address jumping 500% since last September. The dramatic shift comes less than 100 days into President Biden's administration. Today, better than 4 out of 5 Texans, so 82% agree that there's an immigration crisis. Fully 25% of Texans say it is the most important issue, up from 5% just 7 months ago. That is a huge increase in concern about what's happening in the border. You're from Texas. You have worked in this policy area. Give us a sense of what is going on at the Texas border that people in Chicagoland have no clue about.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. The Texas border, as many people might know, is that there are actually a number of ports along the border. I believe there are 8 or 9 ports, and we've seen in Texas front and center the very large number of migrants coming up in caravans from Central America, as well as an extraordinarily large number of adult-age Mexican males who are migrating up. They typically come up seasonally to work in the United States and then return to Mexico. The numbers of those individuals coming up illegally into the U.S. is at a staggering number right now. We had the CBP had 170,000 encounters just last month, which is an extraordinarily high number. In the month before, it was 100,000. So the problem is growing. It certainly is a crisis. The fact that children are very much front and center and involved in it makes it all the more a crisis that must be addressed.
So in your estimation, what do you see these local towns having to deal with day in and day out as the crisis continues? I mean, this has become, obviously it's a state issue for Texas, but locally speaking, those towns are really suffering. Have you been to the border? What do you see? Do you see just like a lot of migrants looking for assistance in any way? I mean, I want to be fair here. I don't think that they're into criminality. I think the cartels are, obviously, but the people who are looking for a better life, they're just looking for a better life. However, Are they just dispersed around the town? What is happening locally? Are nonprofits having to pick up them and help them out?
Exactly. What typically happens is a large migrant caravan, if it makes its way up to the U.S. border, will gather on the Mexico side of the border.
Okay.
Most of these individuals are not going to try to cross illegally or without being detected. They're going to try to come up and claim asylum, which means they're going to voluntarily approach a CBP officer. So what tends to happen is they'll move en masse to a port, and at that point, once CBP encounters them, they have to process each one of these individuals through the system. So once they're on the U.S. side, they're taken immediately to CBP detention facilities, and then, as you said, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, become involved at that point, in large part because the facilities aren't large enough to hold right now all the individuals coming up, particularly the children. So NGOs, by necessity, would become involved very early in the process of finding places for these individuals to live or to stay while their claiming in process.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, there was, of course, a report that they had essentially taken over about 7 different hotels to house these migrants, costing millions of dollars to the taxpayers and their family units, mainly, I imagine. And so the taxpayers are footing the bill for much of this.
That's absolutely right. There just isn't enough room in the detention facilities at the border. Actually, in 2018, when there was a bit of a spike in immigration at the border under the Trump administration, they actually built out new facilities, but some of those were actually closed in the interim between 2018 and now. So there's just isn't enough space at those border detention facilities. So CBP, DHS is having to rent out large spaces and hotels along the southern border cities, which, as you can imagine, that's quite expensive.
So if they have children that are staying at the hotels locally, are you finding that the parents are then actually getting them into the school system right away? Is there an impact right there locally into the school system, or are they just in holding patterns until they separate out into other states?
Typically, they're just processed there temporarily, and then once DHS decides what to do with them, if they're families, sometimes they're allowed in. If they're families with children, oftentimes they're allowed to come in, and they'll be placed at some location around the country, usually taken out in buses to various parts of the country. If they are adults, they're likely, without children, they're likely to be turned away and returned to Mexico. If they're children, there's 100% of the children now are allowed into the U.S.
So children almost immediately mean that they're going to be able to stay in the country and be dispersed into other communities throughout the country.
Exactly. The Biden policy right now is 100% of unaccompanied children coming up from the Northern Triangle countries are allowed entry in the U.S.
Okay, so there's a number of states, though, that have rejected that. It was, let's see, Nebraska, Iowa, South Carolina, South Dakota. In fact, the South Dakota governor, Governor Kristi Noem, essentially said, "Call me when you're ready to be an American." So these folks are pushing back and saying, you know what, we're not ready to accept you into our foster care system. We're not ready to accept you into our state. We know that there's an inordinate cost. Has Texas public policy, have they done any sort of study on the local impact of these families coming in?
We haven't done anything like that, and
it's hard though. It's hard to know, right? It's hard to quantify that, but
exactly.
There is a cost.
There absolutely is a cost, and right now we're kind of in the middle of a burgeoning crisis, and sort of reacting to the day-to-day news cycle on it. But I think looking back, when those studies are done, it's going to be very interesting to see what impact this had economically on states around the country that are allowing migrant families to come in and settle. yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting looking back, sort of as a case study of how this immigration crisis has been handled.
Because it's not a small matter at this point. If I'm right, it was about 19,000 children are in custody now. By June, it's expected to be 35,000 children in custody now. This is not the normal trend. We had basically asylum seekers in a holding pattern in Mexico, and now Biden's policies have attracted this entire trend going forward. But did you feel like under Trump administration that their policies were working? They were quelling the entrance into this United States, or is it always just going to be a continuous problem until we really solve the border security issue?
I think that the Trump policies worked in the short term. They did work to stem immigration in the near term. When we had that spike in 2018, he took his typical transactional diplomatic approach. I worked with Mexico and working with the 3 Northern Triangle countries and worked out deals such as the Remain in Mexico policy, such as the policy where if you're coming north from the Northern Triangle, you have to claim asylum in the first country that you enter instead of the United States, so they have to claim asylum in Mexico, and some of the other deals that he worked out with the governments in the Northern Triangle. Those things helped in the near term. But I think if we're thinking about a long-term solution, which I hope that and pray that we do begin to think long-term, we are going to have to address the issues in the Northern Triangle. We're going to have to address the root causes, as they say, that lead these migrant families to want to come up to the U.S.
Right. So that's interesting because I was reading a commentary in Real Clear Politics to solve border crisis, counter China in the Northern Triangle. And it specifically talked about the economic challenges, and I'm quoting here, facing the Northern Triangle and the rest of Latin America have provided an opportunity for China to expand its influence in the region at the expense of U.S. interests. Beijing's recent no questions asked investments in the region have primarily focused on resource extraction and infrastructure projects, which have undermined progress many countries have made to diversify their economies while consistently prioritizing skilled jobs for Chinese workers. Furthermore, Chinese investments have provided ample opportunities for official corruption at the highest levels. In April 19, the U.S. sanctioned Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega and his family for using a canal project backed by Chinese investment to launder money. So you've got an economic crisis, and so that's part of the problem that we have here is that they're obviously migrating for better economic conditions. There's a path forward to some degree, perhaps using the U.S., Mexico, Canada trade deal, extending that into the Northern Triangle countries, allowing favorable trading status down there. But you've got a huge corruption problem. You've got a huge crime problem. You've got gang problems in these countries that have to be solved locally. And I think we've been working on that, but now you've got these Chinese interceding with their Belt and Road program that they've obviously been successful at instituting in especially African nations where they extract their natural resources, tell them they're going to build some water projects or road projects, and in the meantime, they just rape the country of their resources, sell it off, use it for their own good. This is happening now here with Chinese influence. I mean, this is a problem. Can you talk to me a little bit about that? And then we'll get into whether or not the Chinese are perpetuating the gang violence and the cartel and human trafficking problems.
Sure. The China issue is one that no one really talks about with regard to immigration, but it's something that should cause us to look at the issue as a national security issue, and not just sort of an immigration issue. Just getting back to those issues in the Northern Triangle, which, as you said, that the Chinese are exploiting right now. There are really 3 parts of the problem in those countries. There's, as you said, there's corruption within the governments, which is systemic. It goes back decades and generations in those countries. There's a second problem of security, which has to do with the gang presence in the Northern Triangle. One of 2 different gangs, the MS-13 or the 18th Street gang, control virtually every piece of territory in those 3 countries. And then the third is the lack of economic development in those countries. And one of the problems that we have in the Northern Triangle countries is that they're oligarchs. Very few families own, a handful of families own all the property, all the land in those countries. So when we're trying to bring in capital to that part of the world and bring in companies to invest, it's difficult when very few landowners control the entire country. So that's a challenge. You hit the nail on the head, I think, with the free trade issue. I think that the key for us in order to develop those countries, help those countries develop, is to encourage investment, to incentivize U.S. investment in those countries. And free trade, we have a free trade agreement with Central America, CAFTA, C-A-F-T-A,
Mm-hmm.
which is great. It's a great start, but I think there's more that Congress can do to incentivize U.S. businesses to go down there and invest. I think there's a tourism industry in those countries that's untapped that could really lift them up. But nothing's going to work in terms of economic development until we address the security issue in those countries and make it safer, not only for the people who live there to remain there, but also for U.S. businesses to come in and invest. So in order to fix the economic problem, we have to fix the security problem. Yeah. In order to fix the security problem, we have to fix the corruption problem. And I think
China, coming into our region, coming into North America, Central America region, where we should be operating and where we should have an economic advantage, because quite frankly, that potential market is much closer to the U.S. than the Chinese market is. It would seem that we could put some strings attached to companies developing down there in terms of the oligarchy control, in terms of their crime, possibly. But another, I think, interesting point here is that the way it works is, if you're an asylum seeker, the first country you go to, and this is international standards by, is the first country that you must seek asylum in. That's that's the international standard. And the second thing is once you're accepted as an asylum seeker and it's qualified that way, you don't actually get to choose the country that you want to go to. The international consortium that works on refugees and asylum issues, they choose for you. So these people are trying to direct it. Well, my other question is, like, why not Costa Rica? Why not Panama? Why are the Northern Triangle countries, why are they not headed that way, instead making the long trek north to the U.S. border?
I think the answer is because the economic opportunity and the freedom is perceived to lie where we are instead of south. Another thing they see when they look south is Nicaragua, which is a communist country. It's not a great place to be right now. And if you go further south, you run into Costa Rica, you run into Panama, which are not communists, and they're right. Good places to be, great places to vacation, but they're not great places right now to settle and build a life like the U.S. is perceived to be.
Right. Very interesting stuff. So we're going to play a clip here, and we'll just pause this interview. We're going to play a clip of the cartels dropping across the border wall the 3- and 5-year-old that made, obviously, national and international news. So let's play that clip, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so Josh, how do we control this? Why is it that we cannot get these cartels under control? And is China involved in the cartels, the drug trafficking, the human trafficking issues? Well, do you see their hand playing out that way? You've been right down there. You've interacted with these folks. Is there any hope of getting this under control?
I think that when we talk about fixing the immigration problem, we talk about root causes and in the Northern Triangle, we talk about U.S. immigration policy on our side. The one thing that no one really talks about is the government of Mexico. The government of Mexico is a huge problem for us because they're corrupt. They're in my opinion, the most corrupt government in the Western Hemisphere. And
That's saying a lot, by the way.
Maybe those communist governments in Venezuela, Nicaragua that
Right.
we were talking about would give them a run. But in terms of countries that are supposedly free countries, I would say Mexico is the top of the list when it comes to corruption. And it's an issue that on our side is just too convenient not to talk about, because then if we talk about it, we have to deal with it. And the systemic corruption there is what gives harbor to those transnational criminal organizations to grow and thrive. The cartels in Mexico are the largest and most successful criminal organizations in the world right now. And getting to their involvement in immigration or the migrant caravans that come through their country, they don't engage in human trafficking themselves usually because it doesn't make as much money for them as trafficking methamphetamine or trafficking cocaine. But what they do is they control the ports or the cities and the routes that these people have to travel, and they typically tax anything that comes through their territory. So they're taxing the migrants coming north, the caravans coming north, and at times they're seeing opportunities to exploit those caravans in other ways, which may be to take them and start a human trafficking ring. To charge them a surplus on top of what they're already paying to get into the United States. So the cartels are very, very much involved right now in crisis, and they're really part of what makes it a true humanitarian crisis. Now, China has been for many years very much involved in the Mexican drug trafficking trade. And that's something that the DOJ, the DEA, that's something that we've been aware of for a very long time. It's not something that our government...
How deeply are they involved? Are they almost partners?
They are implicitly partners.
Okay, and when we talk about China, are we talking, I mean, it's the Chinese Communist Party. It's not the Chinese citizens. Are we talking about, when we say China in general, are we saying that there's almost a semi-governmental relationship between them and the cartels? Can you look at it that way? Or is this other Chinese sort of gang activity? I mean, obviously, where the Chinese Communist Party just overlooks it, they won't enforce it. I mean, they can enforce anything they want in China. They're a communist country. They can control these relationships that are literally a hemisphere away, and yet they don't. So there's got to be some sort of implicit, approval of the relationship between the Chinese and drug traffickers and the cartels in Mexico. Can you go to that point? Can you say that there's some sort of implicit approval by the actual government authorities?
I think we can look at things that are going on that we know for sure are going on and draw conclusions from those things about what the Chinese Communist Party must know and must be directly involved in. But for example, the Mexican cartels have controlled the methamphetamine market in the U.S. for over a decade. It used to be that most meth was made in stills and in the woods and behind people's houses in the U.S. Right now, nearly all methamphetamine comes out of Mexico. Nearly all the pseudoephedrine, which is the main precursor chemical to methamphetamine, comes from China. Huge quantities of pseudoephedrine have come into China and have for about a decade illicitly, and those serve as the precursor chemicals. Now, about 5 to 7 years ago, the Mexican cartels began to use fentanyl as the base precursor for heroin. instead of opium. All that fentanyl, 100% of that fentanyl comes from China. It comes, they send it over in large aircraft into the capital city of Mexico. And again, illicitly, this isn't for medical use. This is huge quantities of fentanyl, huge quantities of pseudoephedrine coming over from one country, China. And as you know, that's a communist country. The Chinese Communist Party control virtually everything that goes on there. So I think we can draw conclusions about what the Chinese Communist Party's involvement is in supplying those precursors. In addition to that, the cartels in Mexico have engaged in what's called trade-based money laundering for many years. And trade-based money laundering is a very complicated method of laundering drug proceeds that involves, in this case, institutions and businesses in China and businesses in Mexico. And again, as we know, China is a communist country, and what goes on with businesses there typically is going on with at least the consent and knowledge of the government. So if you're familiar with history, in the 19th century, there were the Opium Wars.
Yes.
And those were between Great Britain, our forefathers' country, and China, and that involved Great Britain bringing opiates into and essentially infecting the nation of China with opioids. And I think right now, I think China is doing the exact same thing to us right now, and doing it very intentionally.
So you got the drug trafficking, but you certainly have human trafficking to some degree as well. The New York Post wrote this article written by Heather Robinson, and she said the recent image of the Ecuadorian girls, which we showed you dropped like packages over the southern border wall, shocked many Americans, but it didn't shock experts who say that the human traffickers are busier than ever under President Biden, who has expedited the flow of migrants over the U.S.-Mexican border. It goes on to say that the Biden policy puts pressure on border agents to release families and unaccompanied minors. Many of them do not survive. It's encouraged traffickers to pose as the parents of these children to slip into the U.S. In his work as a border control agent in Yuma, Arizona from 94 to 2019, Michael Gramley saw traffickers providing children to unrelated adults so they could more easily gain entry into the U.S. It was, you don't have a kid, I'll provide you a kid. He said when adults reach their destination in the U.S., they return the child to the traffickers, who send the child back to Guatemala and repeat the cycle. And those are the lucky ones. Gramley said many of these children eventually end up being forced to work in the U.S. sex industry, often in prostitution or child pornography. So the drug industry, the drug trafficking is awful. The human trafficking is just unbelievable. I mean, I don't know how we can stand by and not put the full force of everything that we have as Americans in terms of our assets and stop it cold. Why are we not doing more as a country to stop this? And why are we not bullying people, the Mexican government to get control of this as well?
The second part of that is a really good question that I'm not sure I know the answer to. That I think that our problem just generally over the years with immigration, it's just been a political football that gets passed back and forth, administration to administration, and it's easy to criticize. It was easy for Democrats to criticize Trump immigration policy, and vice versa now. But what we really need is to bring together both parties and come to both short-term solutions to what's going on right now, but ways to stem the tide of immigration coming north at the moment, but then also ways to kind of fix those systemic problems in the Northern Triangle that are causing these large numbers. And I think right now we see Republicans focused on the border and on security in the U.S., and we see Democrats trying to focus on the Northern Triangle. And it would be great if we could come together and reach both short and long-term solutions to the problem. And I think honestly I think that's the reason that we're in this situation today is we've been thinking too short-term, and we've been using this as a political football to toss back and forth. Now, in terms of Mexico, I 100% believe that we need to begin to deal with Mexico for what it is. It's a corrupt state. It's a failing state. It's a country and it's a government that we should not deal with as equals. And yet year after year, administration after administration, we continue to do that.
I just met a U.S. Army reservist up here in the western suburbs. He's 26 years old. He's a citizen, obviously. His heritage is Mexican. However, his grandparents, who had worked here a long time, returned to Mexico for their retirement years, where it's more affordable, great weather, knew the place. That's where they had come from. The cartel knocked on their door that the parents had spent years building, and knocked on their family home and said, "We want to buy your home from you." And they said, "No, we're not. We don't want to sell it." The next time they came back and just killed him.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's exactly what they're doing down there. It's lawlessness at the border or in Mexico, and that's creating the havoc that we have here. I agree with you. We need long-term solutions. Let's face it. There's a lot of people here that say, these illegal aliens coming up, they add to our workforce. They're really good people. They don't really create crime issues as well. And for sure, the large majority of them do, but it's whether or not you're going to have a border as a nation, or you're just going to let whoever in. And there's plenty of illegal activity, criminal illegal activity going on amongst these illegal aliens that must be controlled. It's not about accepting everybody in who would make great citizens. It's about knowing who we're letting in more than anything, and doing it in a more moderate way where we have control of who's coming across our border. So in that respect, obviously we have always said, we can't talk about immigration reform until we talk about border security. So tell me, in your honest opinion, do walls work?
Walls work where we can actually have them in place in the right way, in the right area. Actually, along the border in California, Arizona, New Mexico, a bunch of that is either walled or fenced. There are physical obstructions through much of that part of the border. Here in Texas, we have a problem with the Rio Grande Valley, in that it's very difficult physically to construct a structure along that valley that's going to stay there because it is a valley. It's a riverbed. So you have to build it further in, and if you build it further into the country, then the government has to come in and claim land from Texans, which, as you can imagine, is not going to be a popular thing with Texans.
Right.
So yeah, there are all kinds of kind of logistical issues that we have here in Texas. But just to answer your question plainly, border walls absolutely do stem both illegal immigration and drug trafficking. More so illegal immigration than drug trafficking, because drugs typically come more in straight through the ports in vehicles, or they come through tunnels. But in terms of illegal immigration, physical structures are very effective.
Great. So we're going to basically close out this interview, and I just wanted to know, we're sitting up here in Chicago. We're not as cognizant of the day in, day out struggle that Texans have with border security. We will face it, though, at some point. They are going to be coming up here. They will be entering our school system for sure. Our foster care system, Illinois is a very blue state. We're going to be accepting them. We've been doing that a long time. And not that I agree with it. I don't agree with being a sanctuary state. I believe in the rule of law applied equally to everybody. But it is what it is. This is where we live. So what can we do up here? Give me a couple suggestions what we can do as citizens up here to help during this crisis. What should we advocate for? And do you see comprehensive immigration reform as the solution, or is it border security first, or how do we solve this long term? Couple things.
Yeah, I think one thing that it's important, I think, to keep in mind is, and you mentioned this earlier, the overwhelming majority of the folks coming north in these caravans, they're not criminals, and probably you or I, if we were in their position, we probably would jump in a caravan too, because the alternative is likely to be killed in your own country by a gang. It's typically why they they pick up and leave is because they're under threat of death from a gang member. So I think approaching the actual, I think we should separate the kind of the policy aspect of it from the humanity aspect of it, and remember that these are people that are just trying to make a better life for their families. I think that there's a very real problem the problems we've talked about, the national security problems, the involvement of China, the fact that we literally just don't know who all is in our country right now. Those are national security problems that need to be solved. But I think that at the same time, we should remember to look at the people who are kind of stuck in the middle of it, who become trafficked, or who, if they're lucky, make it up here into the United States, are not they're not the problem. They're just kind of the people stuck in the middle of it all. I think in terms of solutions, I think that we should interact with our representatives, our congressmen, state and federal levels, in ways that where we're pushing legislation and pushing policies that are going to long-term positively affect the countries where these people are coming from. Mm-hmm. So I think policies that are going to encourage business development in the Northern Triangle, legislation to that end, legislation and policies that are going to improve security, and I think we should talk very open and honestly about the level of corruption in those countries, because the thing with corruption is the more you talk about it, the more you shine light on it, the more it tends to recede and go away. So I think that kind of the public discourse should center more around the fact that these are extraordinarily corrupt governments down there, and that's a crucial part of the problem right now.
So, it just caught my mind as you were speaking that in terms of policy advocacy, certainly we can at least say that our laws should be enforced. So the idea that the Biden administration put a 100-day moratorium on deportations of criminal illegal aliens that are found, that is something that affects all of us. This is not dealing with migrant children. This is not dealing with people who came here for a better life. These are people that have been found to be criminal illegal aliens. Deportation should happen immediately. A number of states, I think it's Montana, Arizona, Texas, obviously Florida, have called on him, or I think are suing the Biden administration over not enforcing our own laws that we have on the books currently. I think that's something that's a safe zone for people to actually argue for. Nobody wants criminal illegal aliens here. They should be deported immediately. And so there's the whole sanctuary stuff of like protecting them and letting them back into the to reoffend. Honestly, that's a problem. I think that's where we should be able to find some common ground, I would think, among all Americans, and maybe that's where we work first, is say and enforce the laws that we have.
Absolutely, and I think a Texas court actually struck down that moratorium within a few weeks of Biden taking office. But the problem was the messaging with it. When you put a moratorium on deportations, when you talk about sort of just allowing illegal aliens already here just to stay here and not face any consequences for the fact that they entered illegally. The problem with that is it attracts more immigrants, and that's the reason we've seen the surge that we've seen, is that the Biden administration's messaging throughout this campaign and throughout his first couple months of his presidency has encouraged this. So yes. Absolutely right that we're a nation of laws, and those laws should be enforced, and anyone here illegally is by default committing a crime and being here illegally, and they should be deported, as you said.
Well, thank you so much for coming on our interview in the Spotlight, Josh Jones from Texas Public Policy Institute. And Josh, we appreciate it, because certainly part of the way that we're going to solve this is for all Americans to understand the issue better. And you have actually informed the folks up here. We're going to push this out to our audience so that they have a better understanding of what's going on, especially that Chinese influence, which that topic is not going away. Chinese influence in everything is not going away. I see that the business interests, they need to speak up too. We do a lot of business with Mexico. We have a lot of big corporations doing business with Mexico, if they want to bully people off of Twitter, or if they want to move the MLB game out of Georgia for something, then why can't the businesses use their power to affect change in Mexico, for which they do a lot of businesses and for which Americans buy a lot of product from? So I think that there's a number of solutions that we can affect as citizens. This is an issue that should be solved just from a human perspective, and actually a rule of law perspective, because that is what a nation is in America. We are a nation of laws, and everybody treated equally under that law. So thank you again for coming on. I've enjoyed this interview a lot.
Thank you. I as well.
Take care.
You too.